Hi there, welcome to this presentation on affective polarisation in Scotland. I'm Fraser McMillan, I'm a research associate at the University of Glasgow and part of the Scottish election study team. Everything you're going to see in this presentation is from the dataset we had just collected, two-wave survey questionnaire around the Scottish election in May. This is very early descriptive stuff. We'll be doing something more complicated for the paper. But there's a lot to chew over here, and it would be great to get some feedback on that. Just very briefly, we'll introduce what polarisation is. Classical political polarisation is when societies are divided along some political cleavage, and this is typically understood to be partisanship. The kind of classic example is the United States, a two-party system where people are very divided. There's not much middle ground, and that's where the kind of name comes from. Affective polarisation is when this political divide spills over into kind of in-group and out-group social dynamics. So rather than just disagreeing with the other side, you start to dislike them personally, you start to avoid them socially, and so on. And then opinion-based affective polarisation is when this type of polarisation results from the formation of identities around opinion-based groups. So it's not political parties per se. The current most salient example that would be known to political scientists would be the Leave and Remain sides in the Brexit referendum, and that's something that we're building on with this paper. Now, affective polarisation emerges pretty naturally from several human psychological biases surrounding group membership. This came out of the social psychology literature and intergroup conflict research. Basically, people have a tendency to see the world in terms of different groups or categories of people. They have a tendency to identify with these groupings and to compare them to one another. And these lead to in-group favouritism, which is then reinforced by other psychological biases like motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and so on. And that means that theoretically these identities should become increasingly entrenched over time. Humans can form in-groups and out-groups around all sorts of unimportant or arbitrary criteria, right? So if you've ever watched Big Brother or RuPaul's Drag Race, you'll notice that they often divide the contestants into, totally random groupings and use that to create conflict within the programme to make good TV. So if it's powerful in that kind of context, you can imagine how potent it would be when it comes to political issues and identities. This is just a wee cartoon to kind of illustrate these dynamics. So what this shows is two otherwise identical societies. The only difference is one's got a purple flag, one's got an orange flag, and it shows that our purple lads, we're all great and brilliant and heroic, and the orange lads, they're all idiots who stay in a horrible place. So obviously this is a caricature, but you get the idea. The political science context for this is that researchers noticed intensifying partisan affective polarisation over time in the United States. So Democrats and Republicans increasingly live apart from each other, they don't interact, and they dislike each other more and more. The research has kind of jumped into Europe in recent years with substantial affective polarisation around Remain and Leave identities rather than parties, found in Great Britain in a paper last year by Leeper and Co. They also contributed kind of theoretically by identifying three aspects of affective polarisation, which are common cause with the in-group, prejudice towards the out-group, and evaluative biases. So these tendencies kind of creeping into the way that people view the world. In Scotland, obviously, we have the yes and no to independence camps overlapping with the Leave and Remain question, and also kind of interacting with it in complicated ways. We know that voters prioritise the independence stance, but there are all sorts of issues that might arise from these different conflicting identities. And we just want to kind of investigate these dynamics using the data from the latest survey. And we can kick off by showing how politically polarised Scotland is on the question of independence to kind of set the scene. So in the second wave of the survey, we asked respondents how certain they were about the way they would vote in a second independence referendum. We gave them a 21-point scale in which they could answer this, and basically we found out that we could have gotten away with 3, pretty much. So 60% or more of respondents were located at -10 or +10, so that's definitely vote yes, definitely vote no. Only 7% were genuinely split down the middle, completely on the fence. We see that no has a bit of an edge, but the overall picture here is that, you know, a good almost 2/3 of the electorate are absolutely certain of the way that they're going to vote in an independence referendum. Looking at the data from the Scottish referendum study in 2014, a small number of people decided either way, did change their mind, but it was quite negligible. So you can be pretty sure that people answering a 10 to this are kind of in the bag for either side. So this demonstrates that there's a high degree of polarisation in a political sense on this question. Now, how does identity come into it? So here we can compare the partisan identities, identities around independence, and Leave Remain Brexit identities. We find that from our survey data this year that 61% identify with a party when you first ask them, and then another 15–16% or so do when you kind of give them a prod and ask a follow-up question. There were no probes for the independence identity and Brexit identity questions, so we asked people, do you consider yourself to be on the Leave Remain or Yes No side? And in both cases around 80%, 78 for independence, 80 on the dot for Brexit, selected one of the two identities. So what we can see here is that there's a much higher degree of identification with these labels than with the party labels. So obviously the strength of these identities matters as well. Here we can compare party identity strength to independence and Brexit identity strength. Unfortunately, in the 2021 survey there was a small error which meant that not all respondents were given the party ID strength question. So we're using the figures from 2019 here to compare them to 2021, but you would assume that they haven't changed a great deal. And here we see that not only do more people identify with an independence or Brexit label than with a party label, they also tend to hold those identities more strongly. It's quite striking that almost 50% of people report that they very strongly identify with either side of the independence or Brexit divide, compared to only about 15% very strongly identifying with a party in 2019. So that's a pretty big difference, and you know, it's pretty fair to say that the independence and Brexit divides are very strongly embedded. So just in case we're wondering what's going on inside these independence and Brexit identity categories, we can break that down a wee bit more for you. This shows that about 21% of respondents categorise themselves as a very strong yes identifier, compared to 26.5% for a very strong no, and that's how you get to the 45–50% very strongly on either side of the fence there. I mean, what's really striking overall is just how many people do identify as very or fairly strongly on either side. It's fairly evenly balanced as well, but clearly the yes side have a bit of work to do. Comparing that to Brexit, it's a lot more slanted, so a third of Scottish voters would consider themselves very strong Remainers, with a further 17–18% saying they're fairly strong, and that gets you to about 50%. Whereas the Leavers are quite outnumbered, and this is probably what feeds into the relative salience of these two identities. So far we've seen that people hold the Brexit and independence identities with a similar degree of strength and in similar numbers, but folk do tend to prioritise the independence identity. This is something that we've seen in previous research when it comes to the issues themselves, so folk tend to vote more on the basis of independence than Brexit, and we also see this when it comes to choosing particular identities. So in the second wave of the survey, we asked respondents to pick 3 out of 20 different identity categories, running from stuff like being a parent to your sexuality to various political labels. And only 1% picked political party, which reflects previous patterns. 3.2% picked being a Leaver, and 6.4% picked being a Remainer, so roughly about 10% picked one side of the Brexit divide as a kind of key identity. But that was much closer to 30% when it came to Scottish independence, so 12.8% picking being pro-independence and 15.5% picking being against independence. Now there are various reasons for this that we can speculate on. So One is probably salience. The Scottish versus British identity trade-off is something that just resonates much more deeply than pro versus anti-European, much more fundamental to people's kind of conceptions of themselves and Scotland's place in the world. It's also a highly competitive issue. EU polarisation is very lopsided, with Remain being extremely dominant, and independence is the total opposite. It's pretty finely balanced, close to 50-50, and it has been for some time. Finally, it's also unresolved. Brexit's actually happened, with the caveat that that issue intersects with independence, but independence is still very much a live issue. The government are planning for another referendum. So we've covered the identity aspect, and now we can pick up on the Outgroup Prejudice element. We collected 2 measures of this in wave 1 and 2 of the survey. So the first was group favourability, basically just asking respondents on a scale where 0 is very unfavourable and 10 is very favourable what they think of different groups of voters, and we focused on voters rather than the elites. And we also asked social distance measures, so this is pre-pandemic terminology, but basically that's just whether you would, how comfortable you would be with a child of yours marrying somebody out of each of these groups, and whether you'd be willing to be friends, or how comfortable you'd be being friends with somebody from these groups. Now, previous research has found that these tap quite different things, so that's kind of why we went for them. The first is kind of abstract prejudicial feelings, and the second is willingness to kind of act in line with those feelings. So what we see here are plots summarising the responses of independence and Brexit identifiers to the first of those questions about the favourability of different voter groups. So we have yes voters, no voters, Remain voters, Leave voters, SNP voters and Tory voters. And we've got the yes identifiers, the no identifiers, the Leave identifiers and the Remain identifiers. Some of these patterns aren't what you'd expect. So maybe more in line with expectations, we see that yes voters tend to have quite strong in-group favouritism. However, they don't have particularly strong out-group animosity towards Leave voters. The group that they really dislike are Conservative voters. And there's a similar pattern with no voters. They demonstrate less bias in either direction. They're still obviously more favourable towards no voters and less favourable towards yes voters, but they tend to be closer to the middle. The group that they really don't like are SNP voters, and obviously they're quite split on the European thing, because that group is internally divided. When it comes to Brexit identities, the Leave group are the least biased in either direction. They do have obviously some respondents who really like Leave voters and really dislike Remain voters, but again, the group that they tend not to like more than any other is the SNP. Otherwise, the medians for every other group are in the middle. The Remain voters do have, similar to yes voters, quite strong in-group favourability and out-group prejudice. They have quite a high opinion of themselves and quite a low opinion of Leave voters, but they also, again, dislike Conservative voters the most. We see a similar story coming out of the social distance measures. These graphs show how the average member of each of these independence and Brexit identity groups fell on a scale of how comfortable they would be if their child married somebody from each of these groups. And we know we're cheating slightly by taking the mean on an ordinal scale, but it illustrates it nicely. I suppose the positive news is that most people are pretty tolerant. People tend to be fairly or very comfortable with their son or daughter marrying somebody from a different camp. Although where there is in-group bias, it follows the same patterns as before. It's not so much the Brexit or independence outgroup that people are hostile to, although obviously there is a difference. It's more the party, particularly for yes voters and Remain voters. Again, there's a high degree of disdain for Conservatives among those groups. And yet again, yes voters tend to be the most in-group favourable and out-group hostile. We see exactly the same patterns for the next question about whether people are personally comfortable having friends of a certain group. Although people are a little bit more negative here than when it comes to the marriage question, which suggests that maybe when they're thinking about their own life and their own behaviour, rather than their son or daughter, they're more inclined to say, actually, you know what, I wouldn't hang about with somebody like that. So to sum up, what we see is that there's quite a complicated picture of identity in Scotland. There's strong political polarisation on independence, but yes and no identifiers are relatively tolerant of each other. So there's maybe not so much affective polarisation on this question as you might expect. That said, it's the party labels that attract more negative attention. We're not entirely sure what this means yet. That's something for the next step of the analysis. Something that we're wondering about is whether old partisan animosities are driving the new divides. So a big part of the appeal of independence and the Yes campaign in 2014 was Scotland escaping from, the dominance of the Conservatives at Westminster. There's also not much of a demographic basis for the political differences on the independence question. Families tend to be quite divided on it. Age is the only major demographic predictor nowadays, and that probably means there's greater contact between the two different groups. Unlike Leaving Remain in England, then, there's no single kind of lightning rod for all manner of social and political divides. And that's it from me for the moment. Thanks very much for watching. If you'd like to see more of our analysis, get your hands on some data, or get more information about the project, do visit scottishelections.ac.uk or follow @ScottVoting on Twitter. If you'd like to get in touch about this particular presentation, chuck me an email on fraser.mcmillan@glasgow.ac.uk. Thanks again.